When I'm on the ground talking to people, it's standing ovations. When
Yeah.
I'm talking to people because I'm talking about where America is. The idea that I'm not the serious candidate, those people are not serious about the fact that people don't have health care. Those people are the ones who aren't serious about the fact that people are rationing insulin. Those are the ones who aren't serious about the fact that this planet could be uninhabitable the way they're ramping up fossil fuel extraction. They're the people who aren't serious about the suffering involved in having to work 2 or 3 jobs,
Yeah.
not having a place to live. So this is the serious candidacy. And for people who are on the left, like you sent me the article about AOC. How are you going to push Biden to the left by endorsing him? How are you going to push Biden to the left by voting for him? I just don't understand that.
Yeah, I do think the fact of this being a Democratic primary makes it less convenient for folks who would ordinarily rely on, let's say, the spoiler narrative to dismiss your campaign. So let's take the Eric Levitz article as an example. For me, the purpose that's served by omitting you entirely is that he can then make the case for why diminish Biden when it's obviously the case that he's going to be so much better than Trump. You can kind of skip to the general election and go right to the vote blue no matter who arguments. And then any evidence you find that Democrats have behaved better than Republicans, of course, there are many of those. I don't think that anyone would dispute that. Then you can say anybody who's then complaining about Democrats not doing more is doing so in bad faith and is just being critical for the sake of being critical and is a bad faith actor who shouldn't be taken seriously. But if there is an alternative option in a primary where there's no spoiler effect, because again, it's a primary. I don't know why I have to keep saying that. I feel like I'm in like baby's first general election. It's crazy that I have to say that over again. Like I'm doing a Sesame Street episode.
Like it's kindergarten political understanding. Hello,
P is for primary. There's no spoiler effect. Yeah, but it then they have to wrestle with, well, maybe if your ethics and values and policy priorities were aligned with someone like Bernie Sanders the next time around, what excuse do you have not to take Marianne Williamson seriously? And if you think she's not going to win, that's great, but it's a primary, so why is that even in the calculation? I mean, so tell me what you have been experiencing on the ground. Tell me where you just came from, where you're going, and what it's been like.
I just came back from South Carolina. It's very exciting. It's very exciting. The people are listening at I wouldn't say a deeper level, but at with a more expanded sense of possibility. In 2020, if you were talking to a Democratic audience, all they wanted to know was what it's going to take to beat Trump. Mm-hmm. People were in a panic to beat Trump, which I understand. But also, in retrospect, it was a naive belief on all our parts that if we only got rid of Trump, if we only defeated Trump, then we would be back on the course of normalcy. And I think people recognize that the problem goes deeper than that. That's number one. So I find audiences open to a broader conversation about what is truly wrong. That's number one. Number two, what I'm finding, which is really interesting, because New Hampshire and South Carolina are both open primaries, conservatives get it too. Mm-hmm. The corporate tyranny issue speaks to Republicans as well as Democrats. And also remember, the majority of Republicans as well as Democrats want universal health care. The majority of Republicans as well as Democrats want tuition-free college and tech school. The majority of Republicans as well as Democrats, including gun owners, want common sense gun safety laws. So I'm hearing a lot of people who say, well, I was a Trump person, but I vote for you, because the conversation I'm having goes beyond left and right, because some of that left and right now is it's not that it's a false dichotomy, but it's not the dichotomy that really defines what's happening in people's lives. That's the powerful versus the powerless. That's the economic dichotomy. And I think that that's what's being heard. And it's very exciting because people recognize that neither Donald Trump nor Joe Biden represent a disruption of that economically unjust status quo.
Well, talk polls to me, because there is this interesting kind of strategic reality that exists now as a result of Joe Biden saying that he's going to reorder the primary schedule basically in his own head and sit out the first primary states, to sit out New Hampshire. And that creates an opportunity for insurgent candidates to potentially take advantage of a new cycle of, if it's a couple of weeks, right, until the next contest, in which they can say that they've won the first primary contest and potentially force recognition of their campaigns in a way that hasn't happened as fulsomely so far in the mainstream. Last I checked, you were neck and neck with RFK Jr. in New Hampshire, I think separated by about 1 point. Do you know, have there been any updates to what it's looking like these days?
No, looking forward to the next St. Anselm poll. The clip from my WMUR candidate conversation did get 2.4 million hits on TikTok so far, so that's good. There's some listening to it. You know, the question that's going to be most relevant concerning what you just said has to do with whether or not Joe Biden will choose to be on the ballot. Mm-hmm. If he's not on the ballot, then whoever wins in New Hampshire, people will say, yeah, but it doesn't really matter. He wasn't even on the ballot. So, but if he's not on the ballot, that's going to piss people off in New Hampshire. And New Hampshire is a swing state that matters in the general. So I don't know what the White House is planning to do, but I know that both Bobby Kennedy and myself are out there in New Hampshire doing what we can. I'll be opening my office there soon, probably in Portsmouth. And I'll be back in that state, but I think the 21st of August. Yeah.
You mentioned Medicare for All a little while ago, and I recently talked to Bhaskar Sankara of Jacobin Magazine, founder of Jacobin Magazine, about why it feels like there is less of an emphasis on what was the flagship leftist policy priority in 2020 and 2016.
I don't understand the left. I don't understand how the word perseverance doesn't factor in more. 1 in 4 Americans live with medical debt. 18 million Americans cannot afford to fulfill the prescriptions that their doctors give them. 68,000 Americans die every year from lack of health care. People are rationing their insulin. 85 million Americans are underinsured or uninsured. People are putting GoFundMe pages on the internet in order to pay for life-saving operations for themselves and their children. How can you just drop this?
Yeah.
How can you just drop this?
It's an interesting psychological pivot, and I've been really trying to understand it, in part because I was so interested in how we got to a place where suddenly you were allowed to care about that, right? Like something I often said about Bernie 2016 when I was, an anonymous human being affected by the movement shift like everybody else, was that it felt like my kind of amorphous personal ideals had never really been validated in a serious mainstream way. But that in the 2016 campaign, suddenly it wasn't unreasonable or crunchy or silly or melodramatic to talk about people who die from a lack of healthcare access or who have been living paycheck to paycheck as a consequence of going through the longest period of time in American history without a minimum wage raise. All of those kinds of things, I mean, they get kind of said in like liberal left circles, but to actually have an expectation that a politician, a presidential candidate, would actually be invested in those issues, no matter how popular they were, it felt almost embarrassing. Like, oh gosh, like you actually think that's going to happen, you moron, right? And there was something about 2016 that suddenly made it not just not embarrassing, but the expectation that if you had a heart, you would vote your ideals. And now it almost feels like because of perhaps Bernie's subsequent losses, people are ashamed again to admit that they ever were fighting for something like that. Or maybe, this is an argument that I floated to Bhaskar, maybe in the context of the force the vote debate, so many people on the left arguing against the possibility of fighting in that moment for Medicare for all put themselves in a position where they no longer really have the credibility to say it mattered as much, because if it really did matter that much, then you should have put it all on the line back then in the force the vote moment. I don't know. Have you given that any thought?
What I know is that there is a candidate running for the Democratic nomination who puts first and foremost in her agenda Medicare for all. All of these things that certain people say they care about, said they cared about, felt one way in 2012, another way in 2016. Is the left going to go for power or not? I mean, none of this other stuff. It's almost like we're sitting here and like trying to psychoanalyze the left rather than just arguing that the left have a spine. And if you do, when you see people either endorsing a president who has said that he would veto Medicare for all, a president who was not standing for a real leftist agenda. It was just kind of moving us slow walking towards maybe someday we will have it. I think the question that I'm most concerned about is not how people felt 4 years ago, but what's happening right now.
That's what I'm trying to get at, because there's been a shift. It's in many respects the same people. Just like you pointed out that even PodSave and CNN gave you a platform back then, they won't now. The same people have a different approach. Even PodSave, I had John Lovitz on the Bernie podcast during the campaign, and even he had to make noises that gestured at the legitimacy of Medicare for all. Now, he argued that Kamala Harris's Medicare for all plan really was a Medicare for all plan, which it obviously wasn't, and we debated it. But even all of the candidates in the race had to at least pretend like they cared and agreed with Bernie in some way on that issue. Mm-hmm. And today, it's not just that those people are no longer feeling the need to do that. It's that the leftists who purported to care viscerally, to care deeply about that issue, are now in a place where they're like, well, it's not going to happen, and for 20 years anyway. Yeah. So,
and exactly that goes back to, but there is a candidate who stands for it. That's why when I heard Emma Vigeland said, well, I think her candidacy is overrated. This isn't about me personally. This is about the fact that you actually do have a candidate standing for those things. And there's this, I almost get the feeling people are like, yeah, we want those things, but I just wish it wasn't her.
Yeah, it's the same with some of the criticism around Israel-Palestine, which we talked about at length, different, personally and privately and on camera at different points. And I agree with much of I feel like we have a difference of opinion about the one state versus two state solution and the viability of each. And yet now, especially with someone like RFK Jr., having so many comments on the record. Most recently, he did this sit-down event with Rabbi Shmuley, in which there were, I've heard you describe his talking points as an AIPAC conference from 2005.
Worse. It's very far-right position. His interview with Shmuley is a very really extreme far-right position on Israel at a time when you have some serious far-right extremists in the Netanyahu government, Ben-Gvir and so forth. So the idea that anybody running as a Democrat would be taking a stand for such extreme far-right Israeli politics in a way that is an unacceptable failure to recognize the human rights of Palestinians is really shocking to me, actually. And that's what people who call themselves progressives support that. That's, once again.
And yet, I will say there are many who were, I think, interested in RFK Jr.'s campaign who have taken a firm and principled stand in criticizing him on that. People like Max Blumenthal, he wrote a scathing critique of his most recent sit down with Rabbi Shmuley. And I think that others who have been critical of you in the past over at RBN, et cetera, have similarly been critical of RFK. Like I know that Sabs has been principled and consistent on that issue. But there are others who I've seen kind of hand wave it away and say, well, my number one issue is Ukraine war funding, let's say, for instance, or my number one issue is politicization or weaponization of the deep state. And therefore, I'm going to stick with him. And so I am one that is, I'm not going to tell someone what their political priority should be. But I am curious about why, for so many people, it was once Medicare for all. And these kind of domestic policy, working class issues. And now it has shifted into the realm of foreign policy. And domestic policy is only really raised in that context as a example of what could be done instead with foreign spending, even though there's no relationship really between the two. You only really hear people talk about domestic policy these days if they're saying, well, imagine how far that Ukraine money could go at home. Imagine. Not that we're going to vote for it or anything.
First of all, how can you say that there's been a shift to foreign policy if you're ignoring, not you personally, if they're ignoring the Israel-Palestine issue?
Absolutely.
So there's not a shift there's just the lack of consistency, the lack of perseverance on issues that really matter. If we on the left are completely abandoning a stand for economic justice for the average American, what are we? If we are completely abandoning the struggle for Medicare for all, for universal health care. What do we stand for? And then to say we're switching to foreign policy because there's a concentration on Ukraine, but then being willing to be okay or just wave away something as really serious as, for instance, Bobby's position on Israel and Palestine. And the reason that position matters is because that's already a position which is held within the Israeli government. So I don't think that there's a lot of consistency. I don't think there's a lot of a principled stand. I'm not sure. I think this is a real moment for the left in America to decide not only what it stands for, but its willingness to harness political power. And once again, take me personally out of it. When you have a candidate and only one candidate standing for those that leftist agenda within the Democratic Party, not a spoiler. And then you have so-called progressive congresspeople who are endorsing Biden. How will the left ever do anything to in any way counter this right-wing undertow that is taking us in? It's such a right-leaning Overton window that there's at this point basically no serious political force field to repudiate what could be a neo-fascist takeover of this country. Because I don't believe that neoliberalism will keep the fascists at bay. I agree with Roosevelt when he said we won't have a fascist takeover in this country as long as democracy delivers on its promises. And neoliberalism means democracy is not delivering on its promises. When you don't have health care, when you don't have a guaranteed living wage, when you don't have paid family leave, when you don't have tuition-free college, when you have these college loan debts, democracy is not delivering on its promises, and that makes us vulnerable to fascist takeover. And that's the risk right now.
I mean, I think the counter argument would be, to push back a little, some people would say, if that's the case, if neoliberalism isn't going to get us there, then why is there this expectation and why is there this trend of the insurgent candidate, of the outsider candidate, ultimately validating in many ways that same neoliberal order by ultimately saying we absolutely have to vote for the Democratic Party in the general election to keep the wolves at bay? To preserve democracy in a way that for many folks validates this notion that there's value in the long term in crediting the Democratic Party and ultimately demonstrating that no matter how low they sink, as long as they can point to some instances, some significant, some insignificant, of being better than the Republican Party, that they can justify their existence and our enabling of their existence in a way that potentially could block the emergence of an alternative. You know, what do you say to that? Because that is, I think, the other reason why some people have been reluctant to throw their hat in the ring with you is that they gave their last $27 to Bernie Sanders with the expectation that it was more than a campaign, that it was a movement. And they found the idea of the movement incompatible with him ultimately endorsing Joe Biden in 2020 and now endorsing him the day that he announced his nomination.
Well, I'm not saying that. And I don't think that I haven't heard Bobby say that either. All I'm saying is that I'm running as a Democrat. I haven't said anything else.
About whether or not you'll endorse the ultimate nominee.
Listen, third-party voices have been extremely important in this country. Abolition came from the Abolitionist Party. Women's suffrage came from the Women's Party. Social Security came from the Socialist Party. All I'm saying is what feels true to my heart today. So I haven't said that. I mean, I do realize that there are many things, even now, that I'd certainly appreciate Biden over Trump. But on the other hand, that other argument is not one that I'm arguing against. It's a real conundrum, and everybody has to answer it for themselves.
Look, I know that you've said, you know, this is what candidates say. Like, if we're going to talk turkey, and RFK Jr. has said this, and, you know, Trump has said a version of this, which is when asked, are you going to vote for the eventual nominee, your party's nominee? Well, it depends on how they'll treat me. You know, it depends on if it was fair. It depends on if the primary, you know, those kinds of things. Mm-hmm. And for some reason, you know, the reality is that when Trump has said it, it has been taken as, oh, he's not going to endorse the ultimate nominee, either because of his temperament, because of 1/6, election nihilism, whatever. People presume that when he's vague on answering that question, he's wink, wink, nod, nodding, saying, I'm not going to endorse. When RFK Jr. says that, there seems to be an openness to the idea that he might not endorse. I don't think that that's necessarily borne out by his history as someone who once campaigned with Hillary Clinton. But people for whatever reason are hopeful and credulous that he won't ultimately endorse Joe Biden if Joe Biden wins the primary. When it comes to you, and when you give that kind of a response to that question, people tend to read it as, no, absolutely, she's going to vote for Joe Biden. And I think part of the reason why is because, that is what happened in 2020.
I endorsed Bernie. Hold on a second. I endorsed Bernie. I did not drop out of the race and endorse Biden. I dropped out of the race and endorsed Bernie. And then later, when everybody said, what are you going to do once it was all at that point? I said, I'm going to vote for Biden. But when I dropped out of the race, I endorsed Bernie. And I would challenge a little. There is a lot of that when it comes to me. Oh, she really thinks all kinds of things with me. People are kidding. People have the projection onto me.
I think that's a really good point about you first voting for Bernie in a way that or endorsing Bernie in a way that nobody else did.
Bernie.
But Marianne, in all fairness, they say this about, I think that you are being treated differently from, say, Cornel West, who also very much endorsed Joe Biden. So,
thank you.
There's no difference there. But I do think, I feel the same way about you and Cornel West in the vote for Joe Biden, the endorsement of Biden. I was against it at the time. I pushed back against Cornel West and Noam Chomsky very famously at the time. However, I think the difference now is, in all fairness, that something has changed Cornel West's mind, evidently, where now he is, in fact, very publicly, very openly not going to do that because he's going to still be in the race, right? He is running as a third party. So that kind of cuts in his favor in terms of the credibility argument of, are you ultimately going to sheep herd me in the Democratic Party? So what do you say to that?
What I say to that is I'm spending blood, sweat, tears, and everything I own on a material level to challenge Joe Biden. And so people who aren't doing more than tweeting are telling me you're not challenging Joe Biden enough. I think I'm doing everything possible to challenge Joe Biden. So if my blood, sweat, and tears isn't enough for people now, and they're saying, yes, but she'll ultimately vote for Biden, how about my beating Biden? Help me beat Biden. If you want a progressive candidate to be the nominee, because even that kind of defeatist talk, what are you going to ultimately vote for Biden? I'm not ultimately assuming that Biden's going to be the nominee. I'm running against him. And if enough people who actually agreed with me would join with me in that, then there would be a different something going on here. And perhaps that will happen. And I think in some circles it is starting to happen.
Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.